The baby's cry pierced through the quiet cabin, just as the seatbelt sign blinked on. Heads turned, eyes rolled, and a few passengers let out heavy sighs of disapproval. In the middle of it all sat a young man in his early 30s, his shirt wrinkled from hours of rushing, his hair slightly disheveled, and a look of helpless exhaustion on his face. He rocked his toddler gently, whispering soft words no one else could hear, but the baby only cried harder. Some passengers shook their heads. Others muttered under their breath. A few even laughed quietly, as if the struggling single dad was entertainment for the long flight ahead. But what none of them knew, what none of them even thought to ask, was the story behind the man in seat 440C. His name was Daniel. A single father of two. He had lost his wife the previous year in a car accident that changed his life forever. Since then, every decision, every breath, truth, every step had been about keeping his children's world intact. This flight wasn't a vacation. It wasn't leisure. It was a desperate journey to bring his daughter to a children's hospital across the country. She was sick, far sicker than she looked, and this trip was her only chance to get the treatment she needed. Yet, to the strangers around him, he looked like just another overwhelmed parent who couldn't control his child. Truth. People should think twice before bringing babies on flights. A woman whispered to her friend in the row ahead. They giggled. Daniel heard them. He swallowed hard, focusing on his daughter, bouncing her gently, rubbing her tiny back, doing everything he could to soothe her. But she clung tighter to his shirt, her tears soaking into his chest. The flight attendant passed by, offering polite smiles to others, but Daniel noticed how her eyes softened when they landed on him. She didn't scold him. She didn't ask him to quiet his child. Instead, she crouched slightly, offering him a cup of water and the faintest smile of encouragement, the kind only another human who understands could give. Still, the giggles and sighs from nearby passengers stung. Daniel stared at the floor, guilt crawling up his throat. He wanted to explain, to shout that he wasn't just some careless father, that his daughter's cries weren't a tantrum. They were the cries of a child whose body was fighting a battle too big for her tiny frame. But instead, he kept quiet, holding her close as though his love alone could shield her from the world's judgment. Then it happened. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats. We'll have some slight turbulence." The plane jolted. Gasps filled the cabin. Drinks spilled. And for a moment, every passenger forgot about the crying child as fear crept in. Daniel tightened his grip around his daughter, whispering, "I've got you, sweetheart. Daddy's here." His voice didn't tremble. His arms didn't waver. He was a rock, steady and unshaken, even as others gripped their armrests with white knuckles. The turbulence passed quickly, but something shifted. The baby, comforted by her father's calm, finally quieted, resting her head against his chest. Truth, passengers who had mocked him earlier, now looked at him differently, no longer as a nuisance, but as a man who carried a quiet strength in the face of chaos. Moments later, the flight attendant returned with something unusual, a folded note. She placed it gently on Daniel's tray table. "This is from the captain," she whispered. Daniel looked up, confused, but she was already walking away. With careful hands, he opened it. "Sir, I noticed you the moment you boarded. The way you held your child. The way you managed every sigh and glare with patience. That turbulence scared a lot of people, but you didn't flinch. Your daughter is lucky to have you." Daniel blinked, his throat tightening. He hadn't expected recognition. Certainly not from the captain of the flight. He glanced toward the cockpit door, unable to see the man who had written the note, but he felt its weight deep in his chest. It didn't end there. Halfway through the flight, the same flight attendant returned, this time carrying something in her hands, A small blanket, neatly folded. The captain wanted your little girl to have this. He said it belonged to his daughter when she was young. He keeps it on board as a reminder of home. Tonight, he wants her to have it. Daniel's heart nearly broke. He tucked the blanket gently around his daughter, who now slept peacefully, her tiny fists unclenching for the first time since they boarded. Passengers who had laughed earlier shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some glanced away. A few smiled sheepishly. One woman leaned over, whispering, "She looks so peaceful now." "Truth, you're doing an amazing job." For the rest of the flight, no one laughed. No one sighed. The cabin was filled instead with quiet respect for the single dad who had walked on with nothing but courage, patience, and love. And as the plane touched down hours later, the flight crew lined up at the exit, not just to say goodbye as they always did, but to do something more. When Daniel reached the front with his sleeping daughter in his arms, the captain stepped out of the cockpit. Passengers gasped softly. Pilots rarely did this. The captain looked at Daniel. True, his expression firm yet kind, and in a voice that carried through the cabin, he said, "Sir." The word echoed, heavy with respect, and the cabin went silent. Passengers who had mocked him now sat frozen, realizing they had laughed at a man who carried more strength than any of them had recognized. Daniel, stunned, nodded slightly, his eyes glistening as he whispered back, "Thank you." And in that moment, the world didn't see just a tired father with a crying child. They saw a man of quiet dignity, a man who loved fiercely. Truth, a man who showed that true strength isn't in silence or status, but in carrying someone else's world, when they're too small to carry it themselves. As Daniel stepped off the plane, blanket still wrapped around his daughter, something unexpected happened. The same passengers who had laughed at him earlier began rising from their seats. One woman with tears in her eyes gently touched his arm and said, "I'm sorry. I didn't understand." Another man handed him his business card quietly, saying, "If you ever need anything, call me." Daniel was overwhelmed, almost unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to kindness from strangers. For so long, he had been fighting battles alone. He simply nodded, clutching his daughter a little tighter, silently grateful that the world could still surprise him. At the gate, something else awaited. The airline crew. Truth, who had been informed by the captain about Daniel's situation, had arranged for assistance. A woman in uniform approached him with a warm smile. "Mr. Daniels, we heard about your daughter's medical appointment. The airline has arranged transport to the hospital, free of charge. And if you need to return, your flights will be taken care of." Daniel froze, stunned. His lips parted, but words wouldn't come. For months, he had been scraping together every last dollar to make this trip possible, terrified he wouldn't have enough for the return flight. And now, complete strangers, people who didn't know his story just hours before, were lifting part of that weight off his shoulders. Tears blurred his vision. I don't know what to say," he whispered. The flight attendant who had stood by him earlier simply smiled and said, "Just keep being the dad you already are. That's more than enough." That's he walked toward the waiting car. Daniel turned once more to look back at the plane, where the captain still stood at the doorway, giving him a final nod of respect. Daniel nodded back, the silent exchange sealing a moment he would never forget. Later, as he sat in the car, his daughter stirred in his arms, her small voice breaking the quiet. "Daddy." "Yes, sweetheart. Are we safe now?" she asked sleepily. Daniel kissed her forehead, his heart swelling. "Yes, baby. We're safe. And we're going to be okay." For the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The journey ahead was still uncertain, but he knew now that kindness still lived in the world, that even in the most unexpected places. A crowded plane full of strangers. humanity could shine through. And as the city lights blurred past the window, Truth Daniel let himself breathe, holding on to the hope that this trip would not only save his daughter's life, but would also remind them both that they were never as alone as they once thought.